Continuing with Matthew this week, still in Matthew 13, we're encountering another parable. This is called the parable of the wheat and the tares. 24 to 30, 36 to 43. Jesus put another parable before them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came and bore up grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came to him and said, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slave said to him, "Then do you want us to gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds, you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest, I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field. And Jesus answered, "The one who sows good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And let anyone with ears listen." This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. A couple of years ago, I presided over a funeral, and it was at a funeral home, and that's always a little bit different because I'm not on my home turf, so I have to follow their rules. And, the day started as all days do. I got dressed the way that I normally get dressed. I wore what I normally wear. And the reason I love the clergy collar is because it's so self-explanatory. Nobody has to ask, "What do you do for a living?" You've watched the movie or two. You know where this comes from. And so when there are situations like this, I'm easily recognizable. And, for funerals, especially for something like processions, the pastor usually gets up at the front so they can be there when the casket gets there and all that sort of stuff. So it makes life easier when they can just say, "Oh, you go over there." They know who I am. But this particular day, I drove up as I did, and as some funeral homes do, they had a servant and a worker outside to greet people as they drove up, to tell them where to park and stuff. And he saw me. I know he clearly saw me. I stopped and I talked to him. And he said, "Okay, you just go over there." And I was like, "Well, okay, maybe that's different, but that's okay. I mean, everybody has their own way of doing it. I'll be fine no matter what." But then somebody later found out that I was going to be presiding over the service. So they said, "Oh, where did you park?" And they told me to move where I thought I was going to park at the beginning. So again, I was just odd. Why didn't they tell me that at the very beginning? When I got inside, and usually there's also another worker there that says, "Oh, okay, I know who you are. You can go over here. Here's the layout," and all that sort of stuff. But that didn't happen this particular day. And again, eventually somebody found out who I was, and so they ran me through the process, and I figured out where everything was, and that's fine. It was just so interesting to me that this is usually pretty veil-proof, right? Everybody recognizes it. And I was wondering, did they just not ever watch the right movies? Maybe they're so anti-Catholic they don't even know what this is to do. It didn't hurt my feelings or anything. It wasn't a shock to the ego. I just didn't understand why it wasn't working the way that it usually did. So I did the service. Everything went as it normally does. Everything went well. And after the service, I and all the others started walking to the car. And when I got to the car, I saw myself in the reflection of my window, and I saw this. And I was wearing a sport jacket and this shirt, and it hit me. I know why they didn't recognize me. I just look like a guy showing up to a funeral in a black shirt, which all things considered is not that surprising. That's what everybody else was doing to some extent. And so it amazes me that this one little thing causes that much trouble if it's not in place. So I have since fixed my problem. I keep some in the car, keep some in the office, so I'm covered wherever I go in case I ever make that mistake. But it's the only time I've ever done that. But it was a life lesson for me because I began to see, I walked around that whole morning for an hour and a half to 2 hours thinking, what's wrong with everybody else? And I was the problem. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So last week we looked at another parable. If you were here or saw the message online, then you were able to know that it was the parable of the sower. Jesus goes out and sows seeds. Some of it falls on a dirt path, some of it falls on rocky ground, some on thorny ground, and some on the good soil. And the seed that fell on the good soil produced an abundant harvest. Last week we also talked about the purpose of parables. And recall with me that we said that parables are given for the purpose of explaining who Jesus is and what God is doing through Jesus. We even went through the parable of the Good Samaritan a little bit to say that a lot of people read that and think it's an ethical lesson for us, as opposed to what it should be, what God is doing through Jesus. Now, to be sure, these are stories told in an indirect way. And as we talked about, these are told that way for the purpose of drawing people in. It's not a straightforward answer. It's sort of like a math teacher saying, I'm not going to tell you that the answer is 10. We're going to work through this together, and you're going to walk each step with me, and you're going to tell me how we get to that final answer. It's sort of like that. We have to do some of the work. And I think part of the intention is, again, speaking to a society where a lot of the workers would have been outside, talking to fishermen, talking to farmers. They would have had some time out in the fields, time by themselves to be out there thinking. They hear Jesus teaching, they walk away. Throughout the week, they're pondering. They're mulling over these words. They're chewing on them, trying to figure out, what was this guy getting at? Maybe they even talk about it with their friends. But again, they're invited into the process of learning. Now, I think that's just a good method for teaching in general. But I also think it's pretty clearly what we find in the Old Testament time and time again. Have you ever noticed when you've read the Old Testament, there's not one book of the Bible that says, here's a theological essay explaining such and such? What do you find in the Old Testament? Stories. A lot of stories. And when you don't get stories, you get poetry. And when you don't get stories or poetry, you get odd books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which seem to feel like philosophy, thought experiments. Job is much the same way. You never get a straightforward, here's what you do, or here's what you think. You're invited into the process. Stories do that. Poetry does that. The philosophy lessons, they do that. So it makes sense. And of course, among the prophets, there are a lot of parables as well. So it makes sense that Jesus would continue that process. He's doing a very Jewish thing of teaching people by this sort of indirect method. And just some examples from the Old Testament. When I was a kid, my mom had a Bible story book, and in it, my favorite story was the Samson story. I mean, what's not to like? A dude with super strength, all because he just grew his hair really long. I was like, I could do that. I never did, but I could. I can't now, but I could then. I thought Samson was a great story. I thought he was somebody that we should emulate and model ourselves after. I mean, yeah, I know he made some mistakes, but he got it right in the end, right? Or maybe Gideon. This is a story that's in my kids' Bible story books, and I've read over and over again. And the way that it portrays the Gideon story is, okay, he was a little bit unsure at the very beginning, so he asked God for a couple miracles just to make sure that God was telling him the truth. But in the end, he did what God wanted, right? And with 300 people, he scared all the Midianites away. I think it was the Midianites, and defeated. Like, that's a great story. That's something we should emulate, right? Well, certainly the children's Bible story books paint it that way. But if you get out of the children's Bible story books and go read the text for yourself, what do you find? Well, since Gideon shows up first in the book of Judges, again, he seems to waver on his faith. God clearly tells him, go do this. And he's like, okay, but how do I really know? So I'll give you a test. God did it. Well, okay, maybe that was accident. How can I really know? and he gives him something else. It seems like we're trying to get an understanding that maybe this guy isn't all that great. Maybe he shows up from the very beginning with a lack of faith. By the end of the Gideon story, he's worshiping other gods. Right? There's nothing about the Gideon story that says, I should be like him. It seems like once we read this story and ponder it a little bit, what the Bible story is doing is telling us, don't be like Gideon. And inconsistent at best. Be more like some of the other people we've read before. Joshua. Somebody like that. Samson is much the same. By the very end, of course, he does pray and knocks the pillars down, and all the Philistines fail and die in the midst of that. But I think part of us, we're meant to be left with a bad taste in our mouth. Samson had everything at his disposal, and yet this was the best he could do. What would have happened if Samson had remained faithful from the very beginning? Where would Israel be at that point? Where would Samson be able to lead them at that point? And again, you only get this when you ponder the story a little bit, when you think it through, when you read it slowly. Read it a few times. And it seems like that this is exactly what Jesus is doing too, inviting us into the story so that we are part of discovering the answer. Last week's parable invited us in to the possibility of abundance. If we hear Jesus' message, if it excites us, then we can join in. We can show that we are the good soil through which abundant fruit can be had. But last week the tone was a little bit different in that parable. Not only is there an abundance of harvest, but there's really not any mentioning about judgment, not directly anyway. And it seems like part of the parable is given, yes, to explain what Jesus is doing, but also to explain why aren't people getting on board with this? And part of the reason the parable explains is that, well, they're just not good soil. They're not receptive to what God is doing in and through Jesus. This week, it seems to have a slightly different image. It certainly shows that what God is doing is something good. He wants to produce an abundant harvest again, full of good seed. But this week, we also began to see that, well, there's still people aren't responding. And actually, why is there so much evil still present if God's kingdom is here? If Jesus is really bringing God's kingdom presence to this earth, why can't we see it more clearly? Why are there still so many bad people hanging around? Well, we're helped a little bit because Jesus gives us some answers. He interprets the parables a little bit. But as you can tell, that doesn't really solve all the problems, so we still have to do some work as well. So again, we remind ourselves that parables tell us about what God is doing, not primarily what we are to do on an ethical level. We talked about last week that one of the expectations that people had with the Messiah is that he would show up with sword in hand, ready to take out the oppressing nation so that Israel can be a free people once again. And of course, we said too, if we know anything about Jesus, we know that is exactly what did not happen. It doesn't seem to be what he was trying to do whatsoever. Last week's parable showed us why people were missing out. This week's parable shows us why it's taking so long. And why. And again, why so many of the bad people, like the Romans, are still hanging around. I think it shows us that what is happening is that Jesus is working on a different level than people are willing to look. The reason his impact isn't making such an apparent impact is because he's working on a different level. He's working on a spiritual level, doing spiritual work. And I don't mean to suggest that this spiritual work doesn't have anything to do with the physical world. It certainly does. But Jesus is going to say that the enemies aren't just the Romans. I mean, they're part of it, but they're caught up in a system that somebody else has control of. Jesus is trying to rid the world not just of bad people, but to try to disarm the spiritual rulers of this world. And again, these spiritual rulers manifest themselves in certain ways, violent and oppressive empires being one of them. But there are also more subtle ways that the evil is present in this world, and Jesus is trying to deal with that just as much as anything else. And further, sometimes because of that, because he's doing that work, sort of on a different spiritual level, it's sometimes hard to figure out who the good and the bad actually are. Analogy I used at Temperance Hall was that, let's say there's Joe. Mr. Joe right here is one of the bad men of the world. He does all the things that we think Christians should not do or be a part of, and he doesn't care that anybody doesn't like it. He's Joe. He does what Joe does, and doesn't matter. But then we have Bill over here. Yesterday, Bill was doing exactly the same thing that Joe was doing, but today, Bill became a follower of Jesus. Now, just outwardly speaking, how different are their lives going to look? And the answer would, of course, be not that different. But if somebody went around and looking at people and saying, well, that guy looks bad, and I'm going to weed them both out, they're going to take Joe and Bill both, whereas Bill is on the good side now. And so this parable is based on an understanding that you need to take a step back. Because God, through Jesus, is doing something on a spiritual level, we can't see all the outworkings of it just yet. The reason that Jesus uses this parable with wheat and something called tares is because in the very early stages, and even for much of the stage of growth, you can't tell the difference between the wheat and the weed until it is fully grown. For most of their lives together, they look exactly the same. And so again, if these reapers were going to go out and say, do you want us to pull up the weeds? It's very likely that they could pull up all the wheat and only leave weeds because they look exactly the same. So they need to do some work. They need to do some waiting. The only way you're going to be able to know whether something is the good or the bad is to just wait and see it full grown. Judging too early might destroy the good along with the bad. But if you wait, you can see the difference clearly. Thus, one of the things that we have to do is wait for the fullness of God's kingdom to show up. And waiting is, of course, the hard part. It's the thing that none of us want to do. I'm sure this has really always been the case, but it just seems a little bit more pressing in our day and age when just people don't like to wait. For the most part, everything can be had in a moment. Just a silly example that I'm sure you all have heard before and that you all can recall. When you wanted to look something up about the Persian Empire, when a lot of us were in school, including myself, what did you have to do? You had to go to the library and get the encyclopedia and look it up and hope that they had something good. Now, you just get the phone out and tap it, and you have it within about 10 seconds. Right? That's great. But we've been conditioned to think that everything that needs to happen now. And sometimes, in our moment of not wanting to wait, we actually do more harm than good. So it seems like one of the lessons, one of the applications, once we see what God is doing through this parable, one of the applications that we can take from it is that it might just be best to trust that God has done and will continue to do what is needed to accomplish His kingdom. It's easy to look at the world and the people in it, to see all the troubles that are in the various parts of the world, and to just lament and cry out to God, why don't you show up and do something? And while I empathize with that, we just can't know right now in our present state that God isn't already present and doing something. And maybe He's doing something that will gradually take time, and over time it can change the context of the people that are there and change the situation completely, such that we will all rejoice because of that change. But because we can't know that, there's no need for us to sort of jump in and say, well, God's not doing anything, let me do it. Instead, it would be better just to trust God, that He has done and will do what is needed in those situations. What is clear in this parable and last week's parable is that God, through Jesus, is showing up and doing a new thing. He is bringing His kingdom. Part of what is included in His kingdom is a new group of people who will live in a new sort of way. And if we ever wonder, well, what will those new people look like? If we're in Matthew's gospel, all we need to do is flip back a few pages and look at the Sermon on the Mount. What are the people of God? What are the people of God's kingdom meant to look like? 3 great chapters full of wonderful information. And since this parable has a theme of judgment to it, I thought it would be interesting to go look back in the Sermon on the Mount and see what Jesus says about judging in general. If you go to the beginning of chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, we'll read this. Do not judge, so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged. And the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? First take out the log in your own eye, and then you will clearly see and be able to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. All right, this is just one of the many applications we could think about, but one that impressed me this week, in part because I'm such a terrible person. Now, it's not bad to see evil and to say something is evil. That's not bad. I think that's called discernment. To know what is good and to pursue that. To know what is bad and to avoid that. That's discernment. You can do that. But then to make statements regarding other people and their status before God because of those things you think are evil, well, that's when we cross the line. That becomes judgment. And I read a story recently that, for me, helped me highlight the point, and I hope that will do the same for you. It's one of the many interesting stories from a book called The Sayings of the Desert Fathers. There are many variations of that, and I've used them before. Again, these were early Christians around the 300s, 400s, and beyond, that when they became followers of Jesus, they went out to go live in the deserts because that's where the demons dwelt. That's where they could be in spiritual battle, spiritual warfare, to be people of prayer and to change the world as a result of that. But this one particular saying that I found was focused on a man named Moses the Black, a man from, I read, Ethiopia, who had lived a life of crime. I think was even a more murderous-prone type of individual. But once he came to faith, he was one of those who was so convicted of his sinfulness, went to go live out in the desert in monastic communities, eventually became a monk of great respect and holiness. And so the story goes like this. A brother in the community where these monks lived had committed a fault, and a council was called together, which Moses was invited to join, but he refused to go. Then the priest sent someone to him saying, "Come, for everyone is waiting for you." So Moses got up and he went, and he took a leaking jug, filled it with water, and carried it with him. And the others came out to meet him and said, "What is this, Father?" And the old man Moses said, "My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them. And today I am coming here to judge the errors of others." And when they heard that, they said no more to the brother, but forgave him. Now, that's a great story, but it's almost like a parable in and of itself. It's an enacted parable. Moses is trying to say, you're asking me to come here and condemn this person for some sin that they did, but look, I sin all the time, and I don't even know it. My sins run behind me, and I can't see it. And yet you're wanting me to stand here and judge this person. And everybody got it. They understood. It was Moses teaching a lesson in an indirect way. They were invited to see the meaning. There's nothing about what I read that said, here's A, here's B, here's C, follow this list and you got it right. No, he invited them into a story and they figured it out. Now, the interesting thing is that we, like Moses in this story, we don't need to be completely inactive. Just because we don't judge doesn't mean we can't be inactive. It means that we can really only judge what we know, which would be ourselves more than anything. Again, in this parable, the wheat and the tares, we're invited to be a part of what God is doing. We are called to come and respond to Jesus, to be among the good fruit, to be a part of his kingdom, to be useful, to be holy. And while I think there are times when the message of Christianity is too individually focused, that it's all just about me and Jesus, it forgets the community aspect to it, there are times when we need to be individually introspective. So we can be a little bit more like Moses. Instead of looking at others and seeing all the wrong that they're doing, we can kind of turn the mirror back on ourselves and say, where am I messing up? What am I doing wrong? And if I can really locate my own wretchedness, my own need for God, then I'm going to be much more compassionate when I start looking out and seeing the world of others. And I think Jesus' parable invites us to at least do that. If we're going to be waiting so long for God's kingdom to show up, and it takes so long for the good and the bad to be determined which one is which, it seems like to me that one of the responses that we could have in light of what God is doing in Jesus is making sure that we are growing ourselves by God's grace and guidance through the Spirit to be as good fruit as we could possibly be. While we wait for God's final coming in Jesus' return, we can, again, constantly look within and judge whether or not we ourselves are conforming to the image of the Son. Where we miss the mark, where we sin, we repent. We remember that while it's easy to judge others, our own sins run behind us and we sometimes can't see it. That's why I used the story at the very beginning of my failure to wear my tab. I was the mistake. I thought everybody else was the problem, but it was me the whole time. And I think part of the Christian message is to be invited into that at least that level of awareness of ourselves. Concentrating on our own failures, not for the sole purpose of being despondent about them, but just to simply recognize them, to recognize the massive grace that comes from our Lord Jesus, will help us to be more patient as we deal with others and as we wait for the Lord to come and to set all things right. God will come in the end to set all things right. But he invites us, each of us his faithful, to get ready here and now, so that in the end we may be found among the wheat, that we may shine like the sun in the kingdom of our Father. And so as Jesus closed, so will I. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.